thank you. I'm in awe for a 10:15 wet, rainy, start on a Saturday.
It feels like a university lecture. You drag yourself out of bed too.
And you have people pointing, fingers and guns at you as you sit there. So, well, thank you for joining us. I have my sort of book of Sathnam's sort of wonderful new book, a sequel to his earlier work, Empire Land, which I bought pre-signed, so that depending on how this talk turns out, he if he wants to refuse to sign my copy. No, but it's actually been really wonderful reading this book while also over the last few days installing this exhibition, because so much of what Sathnam is engaging with, I think in some ways reflects both elements of the exhibition and the works that we see around us, but I could also see nodding along to my own personal history. The book charts this idea where the first one, Empire Land, was thinking about how empire has shaped Britain. This one looks outward and thinks about how the British Empire has in some way shaped the world that we continue to inhabit today, and in some of the structures continues to the world as it moves forward. Just a sort of moment of reflection is as somebody who was born in Lahore, grew up, did my secondary education in Karachi, first in a Jesuit school, and then in the Karachi Grammar School for my A-levels, where the tree was planted by Prince Philip, and I was in a house, it was one of three houses named Napier, Streeton, and Frere. You're getting the picture. And the principal was an Englishman who lived, in the school grounds. To being here today and working with what I've sort of talked about is trying to address an empire-shaped whole in the construction of Britain and British history. Because as we know, I think, histories are not facts. They are stories that have been shaped and then are continually rewritten. And it's the work of culture, I think, to change those and challenge those. And I think Sathnam has been addressing this empire-shaped whole in ours and the world's histories. And we thought we'll start this conversation with actually in talking about one of the things that Sathnam's picked up on is the role of education. And in a funny way, that mirrors the way we start this exhibition, with the work of Zahurul Akhlaq and Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, two artists from India and Pakistan, who arrived in London in the 60s on a British Council scholarship, which was very much part of that extension of soft power after the hard power is withdrawn of empire. They come here looking for modernism, but right next to the RCA is the V&A's miniature collection, and they are smitten by it. So they change their own practice, and not only their own, they go back to Lahore and Baroda, and around them build a circle of influence, create a department in Lahore, and many of the artists here have actually come out of that department. So one of the claims you make in your book, Sathnam, is around the legacy of empire. And one of the things that you pick on is the role of a British education as that gold standard, which is continuing to shape ideas today. Do you want to expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Also, it's nice to be here in Plymouth, a city that helped shape empire and also has been shaped by empire. Often people ask, when did British Empire end? And there's a conventional answer to that. You might say, well, when India became independent, or when we gave back Hong Kong in 1997. But I would argue empire continues, because the British education system, or British education, a lot of it seeded in empire, continues to influence the planet in all sorts of ways. We've seen how it influenced these artists. But even now, I think half of the world's leaders were educated in British schools. In India, at the moment, there's a massive decolonization thing going on. And one of Modi's arguments as a Hindu nationalist is, actually, I am the first truly independent Indian leader, because almost all the other Indian prime ministers were educated in Britain. Most of them were at Oxbridge. Nehru, Indira Gandhi, right? They're all Oxbridge graduates. And so he argues that the influence of colonialism continued to their minds and their thoughts. And I've got to say, as toxic as I find Modi, he's sort of got a point in that, for the book, I went to Nigeria. I went to visit one of their best schools there, King's College School. And the thing is, education here has changed, but that school started in Empire, still operates like it did in Empire, and still teaches some of those values. So it's absolutely no surprise that someone like Kemi Badenoch, who might have been educated in that kind of environment in Africa, can come back here and think Empire's great, because she was educated in a very imperial system, just it was post-independence. So it's a very complicated thing where even independent nations are still going along with colonialism through the gold standard, as you call it, British education system, which is still highly valued. And although it seems to have serious competition now in terms of American education. A lot of people in India and Africa seem to want to get American educations, to get MBAs and to work in Silicon Valley or as management consultants like you did once. Living the Asian dream.
Indeed, yes. In reverse, almost. But I think, just to expand on that point, because one of the framings you do is look at that historical conjuncture through the lens of race and place the US as an extension of the imperial project. And perhaps, a case of where the student takes over the master's position.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it also in the context of, the world that we're living in right now, some of the violence that we're living through, and we see imperial behavior on a couple of continents right now with Russia and Ukraine, which is, that's kind of like what empire looks like.
Yeah, that's a serious case of empire nostalgia.
Yeah.
And what are the Chinese doing? They're buying up resources in Africa, pretty much doing what the British did.
But they're buying, so that's another.
Yeah, I would say they've also got political influence.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole Americans in general don't like it when you say your nation was shaped and created and follows the example of the British, because they defeated the evil British Empire and they like to see themselves as anti-imperial. But I think it's not true, and it's reflected. I mean, this is a bit of a silly point, but almost every single evil Brit in every Hollywood movie is played by a British person. And I think that's because Americans find it easy to believe that British people are evil.
But it's also the accent.
It's the accent. But even the Nazis are played by British actors, right?
Yeah.
That's because they see themselves as anti-imperial, but they clearly aren't. I mean, the way, after they fought off the British, the way America expanded was pretty much was how South Africa and Australia expanded. Settler, colonialists, reservations for the indigenous people, racism. And in the chapter on racism, I talk about Rudyard Kipling's poem, White Man's Burden. It's a poem that I think no one really knows nowadays.
Boris
could probably recite it,
yeah.
Word for word. He's probably reciting it right now. White Man's Burden, that was a poem written by Rudyard Kipling, complicated man, but also a massive imperialist. He wrote it to America, saying to the Americans, you can do in the Philippines what British Empire did for brown people around the world. And the response in America was really positive from the president at the time. They were like, yeah, we can do that. And the British Empire was seen as an example, even by nations that had fought off the British Empire or had got independence, like America and Australia.
No, I mean, I think that's such a great point. And there are two things that come straight to mind, one of which is, again, sort of anchoring it into where we are. So Rudyard Kipling's, so Kim's gun stands right outside the National College of Art in Lahore.
So Kim's gun, you must explain what that is.
So
is that from the novel?
From the novel.
Yeah.
And the curator figure in the novel is Rudyard's father, Lockwood Kipling.
who was an artist, wasn't he? A curator?
Yeah, he was the curator of the Lahore Museum and the
Yeah.
first principal of the Mayo School of Art, which became the National College of Art, whose alumni's work we are surrounded by. So that also just gives you that arc of sort of colonial entanglement that we're living with. The other one is this idea of all these settler colonies that sort of gang together and then have broken apart over time. So in your book you lay out how the original gang was defined purely on racist terms. It was around the white dominions as opposed to the colonies, and then South Africa breaks away when you have to sign a race equality agreement. And then now we see perhaps the other big imperial adventure in Israel and Palestine, which was sort of memorably described, I think, and you quote it as one country, one nation promising a second nation, a third country's land. And I think that clarity of that racial dimension, the color line, as you talked about it, how it still operates, is very much part of our reality, but we are struggling to find a language with which to confront it.
Yeah, it's deeply complex. And let me talk a bit about Israel-Palestine, because it's the most controversial subject in the world. But my argument in the book is that opposite things can be true at the same time. And it's absolutely true for Israel-Palestine. And I'm paraphrasing Naomi Klein's arguments here in her amazing book, Doppelganger. I really recommend it. It's such a fabulous book. But she says, talking about, it's often said, the Israelis are behaving like white settler colonialists. Yeah, you can make the argument. But actually, a lot of the Israelis, the Jews who arrived in the 1940s, arrived as the victims of white supremacy, like the ultimate victims. So both things can be true at the same time. It's often said that, actually I forgot my point, but it's when it comes to the British Empire, those kind of contradictions are constantly true. So British Empire helped spread democracy. Well, indirectly resulted in democracy in all sorts of places. It also led to massive geopolitical chaos in Nigeria, Sudan, Myanmar, Palestine. It led to huge environmental destruction, but also led to the birth of environmentalism. It led to the demolishing of buildings and streets, and it also led to the building of streets and so on. Also, it led to huge species destruction. Lots of imperialists were massive hunters, hunted tigers and elephants to the point of extinction. You see some of them painted in these paintings. But then those hunters set up conservation charities to save the animals that they hunted to the point of extinction. First of all, just so they could carry on hunting, but eventually they realised actually they needed to conserve these animals. So whatever you say about the legacies of the British Empire, the opposite is true to a certain degree, and the same is absolutely true for Israel-Palestine. But it's not a popular thing. You can't say that on social media. Social media is about making one point and making it strongly. And I feel like Israel-Palestine and the British Empire has broken social media, but also politics can't handle it.
Yeah. But I would say, you don't need to use the word social. I think it's also pretty much broken media.
Yeah, he has, yeah.
And one of the things that sort of comes across so strongly in your book is a plea, a very heartfelt plea for complexity, nuance, plurality of voices, things that I could sort of find myself nodding along to. But all the things that every media training course, every curatorial course, will tell you, oh no, you can't do that, otherwise people won't get it.
Yeah, I found that in the reviews of Empire World, they've generally been positive. Yeah. But in general, the reviewers will say, yeah, Sathnam makes a lot of points about it, it's very complex. But Empire was usually bad. And they say, oh, okay, he's written good, but he's wrong, because Empire was usually good. They just can't deal with it. They can't leave it. And actually, the best argument or demonstration of it is with slavery. So this is the way my arguments, I guess, my thinking has changed since Empire Land. We were heavily involved in slavery. We sent 3 million Africans across the Atlantic. Crime against humanity. one of the worst things we ever did as a nation. Also, we had abolition, right, where we set free a bunch of enslaved people, but also fought for the abolition of slavery around the world. 5 years ago, I would have said, the abolition doesn't make up for the slavery. Because when we abolished slavery, 800,000 slaves were free. We sent 3 million Africans to their doom across the Atlantic. It doesn't make up for it, right? But actually, that thinking doesn't work out, because the people on the side of the abolition could say, yes, we freed 800,000 people, but we also stopped billions of others being enslaved. So actually, our legacy is more powerful than the evil of slavery. And these arguments could go around in circles forever. It's much better to just say, slavery happened, it was awful and a crime against humanity. Abolition happened, it was generally good. But actually, it also weirdly led to more racism when the enslaved didn't behave in the way white people thought. It's best to just trace the individual legacies. You don't have to balance them out and come to an overall conclusion about whether we were good or bad. Because ultimately, that calculation is impossible. You're never going to get an answer.
I think the other thing it raises is, what are you going to do with an answer if you got it right?
Yeah.
And you've talked a little bit about reparation, and you visited the Caribbean as part of this research journey. And what's your thinking on this whole idea of reparation?
In Britain, when you say reparations, there's this is kind of a consensus kind of feeling that it's a mad argument. That of course we can't pay reparations. What an absurd thing, And I think there was a judge in the International Court of Justice that said that we owe £18 trillion to the former Caribbean nations. And people look at that and go, that's absurd. But I would just point out that actually reparations have already started. Britain has already started paying them. For example, Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement. That whole process was an act or process of truth and reconciliation to do with an imperial experience. Money was paid. Apologies were given. The Queen apologised. Tony Blair apologised for the famine, for Bloody Sunday. So I think we've started the process. Even in Kenya, the British state was sued because of the Mau Mau. We paid compensation. I think it was £20 million. We were forced to do it through court, but William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, made an official apology. So we've actually started the process. The Church of England has paid £100 million in reparations for slavery, for its involvement. Individual families are doing it. The Gladstones, the Trevelyan's, the Rentons. So it's not that absurd an idea. It's already happening. Even the stuff we've done, though, is quite minor compared to what other nations have done. So Germany's paid proper reparations to its African colony. It's a proper conversation in America. And I just think in the next 10, 20 years, it won't be considered the silly, absurd, abstract thing that it is considered at the moment in Britain.
So, in your sort of arguments, I hear echoes of actually talking about the work that we're sitting right in front of, this long, 9-meter long digital print. It's by the artist Nusra Latif Qureshi. It's called Did You Come Here to Find History? And if you haven't paid attention to it, do have a look when you go back. What she's done is superimposed her own passport photograph with a 19th century Indian photography and with Mughal and Venetian portraits. And it was originally commissioned for the Venice Biennale in 2009. And as you sort of go close to it on either side, you'll see that you can actually see through it. And these portraits, they meet at the eye. So when you try to actually focus on anything, you have to make up the image that you see through fragments that you see. So it is you who's selecting which fragments to see and what story that you're going to populate it, but also you're going to see through it into the other artworks in the show, but also to the other people. And in that way, it serves as a kind of metaphor, which I think also I find lots of resonances in this book, of this idea of, how do you share histories? And you need to do that if you're going to share a place. Because if you can't sort of look at and share those histories, it's always like, no, repatriation, send them back, or you have to, or be proud of empire. response?
Yeah, I mean, this is another thing the British really struggle with, or as part of the culture war.
Yeah.
This idea that history is a fixed thing. It's propagated by politicians everywhere. British history is fixed, we should be proud of it. History is not fixed. History is argument based in fact. It's constantly changing. Our understanding of the Romans is constantly changing according to the archaeology that we're discovering. Our understanding of imperial history is changing all the time, probably more quickly than other kinds of history, because a lot of the documentation was deliberately concealed by the British state. And because of the level of denial in Britain, because it happened abroad, there's a disconnect between our understanding and the world's understanding. But it's a really dangerous idea that is pushed by right-wing pressure groups and the right-wing press at times, that British history is fixed, and anyone who challenges it is woke and should shut up. I mean, I think it was even Rishi Sunak who said that he wasn't fond of people rewriting history. I'm afraid to say, that is literally what historians do. They're literally, even Boris Johnson is rewriting, I mean, he's literally writing the histories of these weird obsessions, right? But it's quite a popular idea that history is facts that you learn at school and they are never going to be challenged, and these viewpoints are never going to be challenged. I'm afraid to say that is not how history works.
I think one of the things, and you know, since your first book came out, I've been following you on social media, so you get a little flavor of some of the vitriol that's being directed at you, and looking at the sort of the subjects that you're dealing with here. There's a little passage where you mention and talk about historians who've been kind of traumatized by the work that they're looking at. You know, so if you're researching atrocities that have been hidden or largely shredded or burnt in imperial outposts so that nobody would know about them, and you sort of found a trace through the work of a historian, how do you sort of kept sanity? How have you protected yourself?
Yeah, but I feel like I'm not in the same group as the historians doing like primary research of atrocities. I mean, there's examples of historians killing themselves because they're traumatized by what they discover, and they're often the first people doing the important work.
Yep.
But often there's a focus on journalists being traumatized and soldiers, but I do think historians can get traumatized. In terms of the abuse I've had, it changes. Like some days you wake up, it's funny, and I post a letter online and everyone has a laugh because it's so ridiculous. Other days it's really scary. I mean, I stopped doing events like this because I began to get scared for my personal safety, and I'm not the person who gets it the most. I mean, David Olusoga, it's a matter of record, has a bodyguard for events like this. Corinne Fowler, who wrote the National Trust on Colonialism, regularly had to call the police, and was libelled almost on a daily basis in the papers, and became scared to leave the house. They shouldn't feel like that. They're just doing history, you know. And we often look abroad at writers being harassed in this way, and we think, God, it would never happen here. It's literally happening here.
Well, as we've been installing the last few days, I'm sure you've been following first the uproar, the reaction to the Arts Council of England's guidance around what is or not full activism, and what is the purpose of art, and what will be funded or not. And then the furious backpedaling a couple of days later with the response.
All art is political. I mean, I often get people saying, you're biased. This is not objective history. There's no such thing as objective history. Everyone has politics. Politics is the way you see the world, right? Every single artist in this had politics. Guess what? Our government has politics. You'd be surprised to discover in demanding this of the Arts Council. And all you can say is, well, look, be honest about your politics. My politics are basically centrist. I have voted for all three political parties. If that is a problem for you, then read someone else's books. But I'm coming straight down the middle. I'm being honest about that. And I think historians should be frank about where they're coming from. And it's pretty clear where someone like, I'm not going to mention their names.
Neil Ferguson, let me mention for you.
Certain right-wing historians, they're obviously right-wing. Andrew Roberts, Neil Ferguson. It's fine. I actually have no problem with Neil Ferguson.
Yeah.
He's probably the historian I quote most. He's a solid historian. I just disagree with his interpretation of everything. But factually, the stuff he said, he observed about slavery and the Tasmanian genocide was the consensus. The interesting now is you're getting right-wing books that are going much further, that are denying the Tasmanian genocide, right? I think we're in a dangerous area now where we are way beyond Neil Ferguson's time. We are in the era of completely made-up fake history, where people are just making up facts, quoting people out of context, ignoring the consensus of the experts. What the imperial historians think by consensus does actually matter. You've got to engage with it. You can't just ignore it, but that's what's happening.
And where do you see hope? I mean, you end the book with trying to breathe life into that most moribund of bodies, the Commonwealth. And is that a thought exercise, a balloon bubble, or do you actually see the possibility of an institution that could be the harbinger of hope?
I guess, that is a bit of a thought exercise. And the Commonwealth, I do think, would be a very good Truth and Reconciliation Committee for the legacy of the empire, because a lot of the members want to talk about it. They're trying to talk about it, the coronation. They were
But we don't want to talk about it.
We don't want to talk about it. But we're talking about this backstage. I actually am incredibly optimistic, because, first of all, this culture war that I've had both books come out in, it's been very stressful for me, but also I feel like it's over. I feel like there's only Jacob Rees-Mogg who's really into it anymore. And even he's not committed. He made a statement about the National Trust. He was like going through this old fight.
Emotions, yeah.
He was going through the motions. He didn't even GB News didn't really believe it. And Keir Starmer, for all his problems, actually took on the culture war and the National Trust. The National Trust have defeated all the campaigns against them. And I feel like young people have got no time for this culture war at all. I feel like the British public in general are increasingly liberal. I mean, there was two surveys came out recently which showed that roughly 3/4 of British people think it's a really good idea to teach kids about slavery and colonialism. That's quite a high number. I think something like 44% of people think the royal family should pay reparations for slavery, which is very high, because I don't think most people understand the royal family were involved in slavery, let alone the issue. So I feel there's a disconnect between politics, the politics of the last 5 years, and the British public, and also I think the election that's about to happen is going to change everything.
God, that's a hopeful note.
Very slowly. They all change.
But you also brought up time, and I'm sort of keeping a little look on time, and wanted to just open up the conversation. We can keep on chatting, we were, and we probably will, but this is the time to sort of bring questions from the audience.
No one ever wants to ask the first question, but you've done it.
How effective is it for British politicians and European politicians, but British politicians, when criticising the expansion of China, of Russia, and their expansions? How effective is it, bearing in mind our history? And is there a more effective way of doing it? Should we say, we're sorry we did it badly, you should do it better, something like that? I don't know, because, if we're saying it, what's the rest of the world thinking as they look at our politicians saying,
Shall I start on this?
Yeah.
Because I have an example. So one of the hats I wear is I run a research project called London Asia at the Paul Mellon Centre for Studies of British Art, and it's part of Yale University. And the London Asia is separated by a comma. And part of the argument is that London has often served as part of British art history. The example I gave you earlier was of the artists who came and then sort of propagated ideas elsewhere. But also to flip that around, to say, well, many of these artists, people like Kim Lim or David Madia or Rashid Arain or Francis Newton Sousa, if you account for them as British artists, what does that do to the histories of British art and what actually counts as Britain? And at the start of when we were sort of setting out this project, I came across a photograph of David Cameron, George Osborne, Nick Clegg, and Vince Cable on the Great Wall of China wearing poppies. Now, this photograph is published in the Daily Mail. What's not published in the Daily Mail is that the Chinese had asked repeatedly for them not to wear poppies out of respect for, well, we know the histories of poppies, or if we don't, we absolutely should. That should be
Opium Wars,
the Opium War, the 100 years of humiliation. So, and I think collectively, that's probably somewhere like a few million pounds of private education in those 4 people that's been spent. So what does that gesture say out of respect? Who are they playing for? And what value would that word have for certainly for the Chinese? I think those are largely shadow boxing for the right-wing press, rather than actually anything that people will listen.
Yeah, you've touched upon my argument in the book, is that the main reason we need to understand this history is because the world understands it quite well, and we look stupid. In short, I mean, we're intervening endlessly in international debates. For example, in Palestine, I think there's very little reflection on how we helped create that situation, but we're always talking about human rights, spread of democracy, the environment. These are all things we have distinctly patchy records on, and it would be good if we reflected on it. The ultimate example for me is the royal family and animal conservation. The royal family obsessed with campaigning on animal conservation, usually in Africa, and they do not reflect, and it reflects what we do in Britain, upon the fact that the royal family themselves hunted massively. I mean, something like Prince Philip actually shot a tiger in the 1960s on camera.
But here's the president, was the world president
The
of the worldwide
no reflection.
Apparently,
Apparently, the BBC had it on camera and they didn't show it at the request of the royal family. But like in the Victorian age, I think Prince Alfred in 1860 had a hunt arranged for him in India where 25,000 animals were corralled into one space for him. People died getting the animals into one space. But, the royal palaces are full with the results of this hunting. The animal skins, the ivory, is everywhere. So when the royal family get up and say, we need to do something about this, poaching, and wouldn't it help their cause if they said, oh, by the way, we've got a lot of ivory, we've got a lot of animal skins, and we're going to do something about that, and we played a role in it.
Stop grouse shooting in Scotland even today.
Exactly, yeah. So, but we do that as a country. We lecture people endlessly on a humanitarian crisis, and it's like, you know what? We were responsible for a couple of genocides and millions of people dying in famine and war. It would help us if we reflected on that. I think the world would see us better.
I think there are tons of little nuggets in the book. One of them was and you'll correct me, Sathnam, but apparently the ivory of 8 elephants is required for a set of billiard balls. And if you think of how the billiard ball was, of course, necessary for your country state, how many elephants must have...
and all the pianos, and we go into the stately homes and we admire the mahogany furniture, and the destruction of the mahogany forests destroyed almost to extinction in the Caribbean. We should reflect on that, as well as admiring the furniture. Anyway, very good question. So I'll let you choose.
No. There's a...
Jallianwala Bagh, from Punjab in India, a very big incident in the history of the Republic. Very recently, just about when they apologized at work. Nothing from the British politicians from my knowledge. What is the emotional bottleneck in the British psyche there? Not the politics. The boys are everybody else.
Yeah, so the question's about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, which is one of the most notorious incidents in imperial history. If you watch Gandhi the film, you would have seen an enactment of it. Up to 700, 800 people died, where General Dyer opened fire on a crowd of peaceful protesters, and the British state has never apologised. Actually, the only politician who has ever apologised is Sadiq Khan, which is interesting because his family come from Pakistan like yours, so actually you could argue that he comes from the Indian heritage, so he doesn't quite count. But the Queen didn't apologise. And you said that the British have apologised for other things, but they generally haven't. I find it quite curious that British people will generally on a daily basis apologise for anything. You stand you stand on someone's feet on the tube and they'll say sorry, you know. But when it comes to things that matter, we can't apologise. We apologise when we're forced to, for the Mau Mau, forced by court, apologise probably as part of the Irish Good Friday Agreement process. But we struggle, even with the royal family in Kenya at the moment, there was a reluctance to do an official apology. I think a lot of that comes from a weird, misplaced idea that we're going to be sued for trillions of pounds by everyone in the world. Frankly, I think that's misplaced. I don't think there's any legal reason to fear that. But also I think it comes from our misunderstanding of empire and what we actually did.
And I think that fear is also misplaced because I think the rest of the world also realizes that we don't have trillions of pounds to pay any reparations. So I think that's not the point. But the point is actually to be able to recognize our own history so that we can have these conversations.
Yeah, and there's lots of other countries, like the Dutch, I think, have apologised. The royal family apologised for their involvement in slavery. Lots of other countries have. I don't know what our issue is. I think it's all tied up with our nostalgia for empire and our ignorance.
At what point do you think you reach a line where you've made enough apologies? If you think of all the colonising empire races like the Zulu, the Mongols, the Moguls, the Moors, no one would ever have time to do anything else but just be apologising to each other the whole time.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. But it is a real point because we're trying to redefine our relationship to the world with Brexit. We're going out to places like the Caribbean, trying to establish new relationships. And we do not acknowledge what we did to those places in the first place. We don't have to apologise endlessly. I would say we could stop. I mean, it's a difference between you saying we'll be doing nothing but apologise and me saying we could just do a few apologies. I think there's a big gap between that. I don't think we would spend all our time apologising. I think a lot of the time people aren't even demanding apologies, they just want it to be understood. And there's ways of doing that beyond court cases and beyond apologies.
But I'm Anglo-Irish, and when the Queen came recently, she didn't do a great deal. She went to a Garden of Remembrance, and it was almost like total absolution for the Irish. There'd be a few Republicans who'd still be angry, but the vast majority of people in Ireland went, that's good, that'll do.
Yeah, no, that's the power.
So you're actually illustrating your point.
I'm not binary. I just lobbed that thing in about everyone has got.
Absolutely, that apology, and I think, I might be wrong, I'm not Irish obviously, but I got a sense that Queen Elizabeth II was quite hugely respected when she passed away.
I mean, in Cork City,
in Ireland.
People were out 24, 36 hours before she arrived, standing at barriers going, we love her, we love her. It's amazing.
Yeah, sometimes you just want to be seen and recognised. And I think that's what the issue is with Jallianwala Bagh. Like, more than a century of no one saying, sorry, come on. It's not that hard.
We have a question in the front here.
Yeah, it's continuing the theme, I think, and it's this. I wonder if you would have some comment on the characteristic of hypocrisy that seems to be quite a dominant feature of British and British attitudes. I was listening to a podcast recently, the David Runciman podcast, about George Orwell as a historic figure. And his point was that the outstanding characteristic of the British is their ability to be hypocritical. It's so ingrained and so deep that it's completely unconscious, and yet we do it all the time. And I wonder whether you could comment on whether you think it is an outstanding kind of aspect or disposition of the British, or whether it's a more universal human nature thing, and whether hypocrisy is in the process of being replaced by what you said, stupidity in the eyes of the world.
I feel like the Britain's coming out quite badly out of this question. I don't think we're the most hypocritical at all. I think America, when it starts going on about human rights and democracy and its imperial history, recent history is not great. Russia, I mean, the word democratic, we were talking about this earlier, every single dictatorship in the world calls itself a democracy. Is it the North Korean, is it Democratic Republic? So we are not the worst. But yeah, hypocrisy is definitely a theme when it comes to imperial history, and talking about the environment, it comes up a lot with that. I mean, the chapter I do about the environment really shocked me, because the extent of the environmental destruction of the British Empire was huge. We destroyed 60% of New Zealand's forests. The destruction caused by sugar plantations, tea plant. Even today, landslides caused in Sri Lanka because of the tea plantations. And yet, if you'd listen to what our politicians say to the world about the environment, the idea is that they are doing everything terribly and we have the solution. Again, no reflection on what we've done, the deep legacies. And I feel like in the climate debate, this is the colonial aspect of it is becoming a bigger and bigger thing. And quite rightly, the Chinese and the Indians get furious about this. It's like, what did you do? I mean, do you remember what you did to us? But also, what did you do in the Industrial Revolution? And now you're telling us not. We can't have the same thing. And again, it would make our case much more powerful if we acknowledged what we did and what relatively other countries are doing better than we were at the same stage.
I wonder if it's got something to do with what might be a reluctance to apologise, but behind that reluctance to apologise, there's this wall of hypocrisy, which is like a kind of blindness.
Well, I think it's that relationship between hypocrisy and ignorance. And I think that's where, and I think that's why I do what I do and why we're meeting here, is where I find the space of culture possible. And I know that the box will be working with the wonderful artist Jeremy Deller. And I'm just thinking back to this, Jeremy quite often works with posters that will just appear in bus stops and almost like a guerrilla work. And one of my favorite ones that came up like this was cronyism is English for corruption. So because we are incapable of being corrupt. Yeah. But cronyism, oh yes, that's rampant.
Yeah. Corruption is what foreigners do.
Yeah.
And I find that in Nigeria, really interestingly, we see Nigeria as a fundamentally corrupt place. But actually, the British introduced some of those values.
Well, just look around the House of Lords. We don't need to get into names. Recent headlines of who's just been ennobled.
And often people say, British Empire was something that the upper classes did. Working classes didn't really have anything to do with it. But I don't think it was that simple, because the working classes did go to empire as well, some of them. And also, the British population in general benefited from the effects of colonialism. So tea, sugar, chocolate, the general wealth of a whole bunch of industries that provided employment, whether it was the cotton industries or textiles in Scotland. And also they often get this idea that, empire was basically English. But actually, the Scottish were disproportionately involved in empire. The Irish, the Anglo-Irish, sorry to say, were heavily involved in empire. Lots of Irish officers did terrible things in India. So I don't think it was that simple. And I think what you're seeing now, obviously, is a weird thing where you see lots of brown people, brown politicians, children of the colonized, being very nostalgic about empire. And that is a reflection of the fact that when you do go to Nigeria, when you go to India, you do meet a few people, I would say they're an incredible small minority, who are hugely fond of the British Empire. They're just not as fond of it in the numbers that the British think they are.
But I think there's something also, an element of truth in that idea of power and its distribution, that preservation of elite culture and the infrastructure, both within the UK, but also its replication, whether that be through schools and you trace some of these through the NGOs. By the way, I love that takedown of Band-Aid and do they know it's Christmas?
It's in the news at the moment because Sir Bob Geldof was in the news yesterday because there's a Live Aid musical, and he took umbrage at the idea of being called a white saviour. I can see that. Look, Live Aid was a great thing, it raised money, it did positive work, but he also created huge problems. There's people in the charity civil sector who think that it caused more problems than solutions he offered. I mean, just look at the lyrics of Band-Aid.
Oh, no,
Do they know it's Christmas? Yes, they know it's Christmas, because the British Empire turned Africa into a hugely Christian continent. You know, well, it's known, yes, it snows in Africa. They have mountains. Africa is not one place. Like, all the problematic things are there in the lyrics of that song. And yeah, we have this idea with the phrase white saviour. If you went to the 19th century and accused various British imperialists of being white saviours, they wouldn't see it as an insult, because that's what they thought they were. You know, they were spreading British values of civilization, anti-slavery, stopping horrific, barbaric Indian customs like sati, burning, widows burning. I think there's a depiction here of a suti, they call it, a sati, where Indian widows threw themselves onto the pyre of their husbands. Obviously horrific, but as I explained in the book, wasn't as widespread as the British said. The British weren't the only people combating it, and actually they exaggerate their claims. The class system was one of the ways in which the British got the empire wrong, because the class system was so profound for the British, the way they saw the world. So they went to places like India, they saw the caste system, and so they saw that as a version of class. And so they basically made everything, in their view of caste, they made the divisions even more stark than they actually were. And even today, Indians are living with the results of that, because some legislation in India is based on those colonial ideas of caste, which were much more pronounced than they were in reality. And now jobs are allocated according to these definitions of caste. And so this is the way the legacy of the British Empire continues to shape people's lives even today.
There are two questions, the lady and then the gentleman next door.
I'd be interested to hear your reflection on the role of cultural institutions in that debate around reparation. So perhaps not beyond financial reparations, perhaps there's that question about education or place of people. I'd be interested to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, you probably got to say that, but I do
Why
think
don't you start? Yeah.
I do think culture and art in general have a lot of influence in this whole conversation, because when you come to a gallery like this, you're not being preached at, you're basically seeing art and you're making your own mind up. And I feel like a lot of change is happening, not necessarily through history books, but through art like this. But yeah, there's a massive illustration of reparations in cultural institutions when it comes to reparations and returning loot. And I feel like the conversation on loot is actually changing quicker than the conversation in reparations. Internationally, definitely, stuff is being returned everywhere around the world. And I feel like even in Britain, I never would have thought 3 years ago that the V&A would give back the Ghanaian loot. Well, they've given it on a long-term loan. But even George Osborne is talking about this stuff. And that's because I think they realise they cannot ignore the international conversation, because cultural institutions are international, and it's reflected in your work. You're everywhere, right?
And actually, the work that you're directly looking at, if you look to your side, is a piece called All Rights Reserved. It's by the artist Hammad Nasar, and it references a work that is in the royal collection, the Badshah Nama, which was one of the highlights of Mughal cultural production. And to mark the 50 years of India's independence, Pakistan's creation, the Royal Collection decided to tour the exhibition. And it started in New Delhi. It didn't go to Pakistan at all. The only place where actually miniature painting was still being taught as an academic subject. It didn't go there. And went to 4 random museums in the US, because they really needed to know about Badshah Nama and 50 years of India's independence before it came back to the UK. Hammad Nasar was a student at the NCA at the time, and what that work does is it takes the cover of the Badshah Nama catalogue, which is the wedding gifts being taken for Dara Shikoh's wedding. She separates the gift from the bearers and reproduces the first 2 pages of the catalogue. One says, King of the World. Which king, which world? Question. The other reproduces that, all rights reserved that we've read on every book, including this. And there's nothing preachy going on, but there is all that is left up to you. Whose rights are these? Who gets to own them? How do we share them? One of the questions that press has asked about this particular show In fact, The Guardian, in its early iteration at the NK Gallery, they did an editorial on this show, contrasting it with Rishi Sunak's performative snubbing of the Greek Prime Minister, to say, you know, rather than kind of do that, spend a lot of effort to do very little, you know, why not go see the show and think about, you know, what these objects are doing here, and think about how you can share them, because that idea of return to what? To Modi's India, where as Sathnam just described, there's a constant effort of erasure, and where the Mughal is now, you know, a bad word. So that's not the question. It's then about how do we share this? Again, that idea of how do we share those histories? What forms do they take? Are they digital? Are they loans? Are they exhibitions? Are they educational? I think these are the challenges that our cultural institutions, I think, can lead if they have the support. And we hope, I'm really encouraged by your hopefulness, Sathnam, for what this election is going to do.
Did you say Jacob Rees-Mogg is now a trustee of the...
He is a trustee of the National Portrait Gallery.
Oh.
And Chris Grayling. But anyway, we want to end on hope, yes.
So I was wondering if you had any ideas about how to educate better, and particularly think about education systems. So one of the things you said towards the start was that one of the main legacies of empire was that education systems are still in ex-imperial Roman places. But it's not, so at the minute in education the debate's about content, but I don't think that's necessarily what particularly I'm interested in hearing about, because the phrase that you keep going back to is it's not that simple. Right? And if you just change the content, you're basically swapping out one set of political facts for another set of political facts. How do you educate people better or in different ways to actually, build in that sense of nuance as well?
Yeah, I mean, it can get very political very easily, and people think it often, oh, if you're teaching the empire, then you can't teach about World War I, World War II, and the Tudors. I would say you can carry on teaching all the tough stuff we've taught before, but there's an imperial element to everything. So World War I, World War II, I spent years studying that, went to dozens of Remembrance Day services. No one once mentioned the millions of soldiers from empire, the resources of empire, that frankly meant that we could win those world wars. That would have made it more interesting. The Tudors, there were black people in Henry VII and Henry VIII's court. There was an imperial element to the start of empire at that time. So I think you can add imperial elements to stuff we already teach. You don't have to wipe out the canon. I mean, even Jane Austen, I was bored to tears studying Mansfield Park at A-level, only to realise 20 years later that Edward Said had written this amazing essay on Mansfield Park where he pointed out that they were talking about slavery all the time. If you read between the lines, it was there. And actually there's an explicit conversation about slavery, but no one mentioned that once in our 12 months of tedious conversation on Mansfield Park. So I think it's everywhere, and you don't need to stop studying Shakespeare to teach this stuff or understand it.
Can I just chip in? As a teacher, the tool you want to supply your pupils with is that questioning and having the ability to look at anything and just realise that there'll be an agenda there somewhere, and to develop those skills of questioning. So you will never teach them all the history of the world, but you can teach them how to question. Totally, and I get a lot of people saying, students getting in touch with me saying, you've inspired me to study history at university. And that's an amazing thing. And they say, have you got an advice? And I always say, look, when you go for your interview, and if you mention my book, point out all the problems with it. Point out how you would write it different. Point out how someone with a different view would have argued a different case, because that's what it's about. And for me, success is having students who read my book as a young person who maybe find problems with my arguments and write a really good book in 10 years' time saying why I'm wrong about certain things. Because that is how history works. And that is what we should inspire in people, critical thinking.
And I think that also points to, I think the role both of education and of culture is how we think of them. Over the last, say, 2-3 decades, I think quite often under American influence, we reshaped how we think about education and culture as part of the wider realm. So, and we use the language of investment, these are not these are rights. And if we can think about them as rights that belong to everyone who's here, and how do we nurture them and protect them, I think it's a different conversation. Because if we start thinking of them as this is what gets us that job, that's what, this is the rate of return on a media study course, and it will be cancelled, and this is the rate of return on business, I'm afraid that's a really slippery slope, because that's not how you achieve excellence. You confine yourself to mediocrity. There is a pile of books assembled on the other side. Sathnam is here, and I think he's got his writing.
Yeah, thank you for your lovely questioning, very intelligent questioning, and thank you for being such a great audience and waking up on a Saturday morning to listen to stuff on colonialism, something I would never do. I'd be watching Flog It in my pajamas. Well done. Thank you.